Happy Wednesday, and thanks so much for joining us for the first webinar in PetSure's Pause and Learn series. I'm Danny Houlihan, Chief Veterinary Officer at PetSure, and I'm your host and moderator for the session today. Tonight's webinar on COVID-19 and pets is brought to you by PetSure of many well-known brands, including Woolworths, RSPCA, and many others. Additionally, PetSure has revolutionised the claim experience with the development of Gap Only. If you would like to find out more about PetSure, please visit our website. Before we begin, I'd like to run you through some housekeeping items. This webinar will run for about 45 minutes, followed by a 10 to 15 minute question and answer session. On the screen, you should see a control panel to your right. If you experience any problems during the webinar, please submit your issue within the question panel, and I'll try and resolve it for you. During the webinar, phone lines will be muted to reduce background noise. Proud owner of 2 cats, Joey and Albert, that love their new home in Hong Kong. So without any further delay, I would like to hand you over to Professor Barrs.
Thank you very much, Danny, and welcome everybody. It's really good to be here. I am having a little bit of a problem with sound at this end, so I hope that everyone can hear me. I know that you can see me okay. And I'm just assuming that Danny, you'll let me know if there's a problem with the sound transmission. And what I might do just to aid the live streaming is just turn off my video for a little while, just in case that the signal is weak from this end. But yes, it's really good to be here with everybody. And I hope that you guys are all doing well. Hi from Hong Kong, and tonight I'm going to talk about COVID-19 and pets. We're all a little bit COVID-19'd out after the last 6 months, but there's always something new to learn, and I'm always surprised at the information that's coming out every day. So this is my scientific disclosure slide, just to remind you all that it's an evolving situation, and you know, there's lots of resources to keep posted. I'm going to present you the most up-to-date information this evening, but as you know, the situation can change. And the things I'm going to focus on this evening are really about 3 animal species: cats, dogs, and ferrets, and we're going to say mink are pretty much like ferrets, so we're going to talk a little bit about mink as well. There's been a lot in the news lately, as you know, we've all heard about human to animal transmission, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the possibility of animal to human transmission. Where are we at with that? And also we'll talk a little bit about testing as well, because that's where the conversation is starting to shift to. We're all probably, you know, pretty familiar with PPE and Plan A and Plan B. So let's look at the next phase. So just a tiny little bit of science. Where do coronaviruses come from? When I went to university, I knew that they were called coronaviruses because they had a spike protein that gave them a crown-like appearance. And I knew that there were two coronaviruses, the feline coronavirus that causes FIP and the canine coronavirus. And that was pretty much all I knew about coronaviruses. And wow, haven't we learned a lot in the last 6 months? So we know that coronaviruses mostly come from bats, and some of them come from birds, and they're divided into 4 families: the alpha, beta, gammas, and delta coronaviruses. And interestingly, not that long ago, another canine coronavirus was discovered, and it's probably not that well known, although it's we're kind of a lot more aware of coronaviruses now in the current pandemic. So we know that the SARS coronavirus is, of course, a beta coronavirus, and there is a canine respiratory coronavirus, which is one of the causes of kennel cough that is in that family as well. And interestingly, these viruses are very big. They make mistakes when they copy, when they replicate, and they also have a tendency to recombine with coronaviruses of different species. And in fact, the canine respiratory coronavirus, bovine coronavirus, and human coronavirus OC43, which is one of the causes of the common cold, are all quite closely related. So that's just an interesting fact about coronaviruses. And I guess what I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight is a little bit of history about the original SARS coronavirus and how that has informed one approach to animal testing here in Hong Kong, which has shed a little bit more light about human to animal transmission, because we know that the first coronavirus to cause highly harmful disease in humans was the SARS coronavirus, which caused over 800 deaths in China and Hong Kong back in 2002. And, we know that these coronaviruses, ultimately, while the ones that are currently infecting us all originate from bats, they generally require an intermediate host in order to adapt to then be able to infect humans. So in addition to the SARS coronavirus of 2002, we had the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome virus, and of course now the new SARS coronavirus too. And the big question is, what is the intermediate host? Is it a pangolin or is it another species? And that question is still unanswered, and unfortunately we might never know the answer to that question. So this is the history that I wanted to share with you, and it's really about the original SARS coronavirus and the outbreak of SARS in 2003 in Hong Kong. So this picture that you can see is a housing estate called Amoy Gardens, and over 10,000 people live in this housing estate. Each block is alphabetically lettered from A to S. And there was a big cluster of SARS cases in this housing estate back in 2003. And authorities couldn't work out how the virus was being transmitted in this particular outbreak, because a lot of people didn't live near each other. They ruled out the lifts, and they were kind of in flats that were vertically arranged. So this is where animal testing has its kind of origins. So initially they were worried that maybe rats and pests could be transmitting the SARS coronavirus, and they started looking in them for the virus, and they found no evidence of replication, and they concluded that rats and cockroaches and things like that were just mechanical vectors. But this really was the instigation to start testing in dogs and cats. And of course we know that ultimately it was faulty drainage pipes that were responsible for the transmission of this outbreak in this housing cluster, because the aerosol from the sewage was coming up through the floor drains through these faulty U-traps because the water was drying out in them. But before they knew that, they did actually start testing cats and dogs. And what they did is they took some swabs from about 8 cats and a dog, and they used PCR to look for viral RNA, and they found the original SARS coronavirus in these cats and a dog. And they also confirmed that the virus was actually replicating in the cats because they were antibody positive. There was no evidence of spread to other pets in the household. But they did conclude that cats could be infected with the original SARS coronavirus, and there was no evidence of transmission to humans. So this really informed the current strategy of the Hong Kong AFCD to do animal testing in the current pandemic. And after the outbreak of the original SARS coronavirus back in 2003, scientists did do some experimental studies. They were published in Nature, and they proved that cats and ferrets were susceptible to infection with that coronavirus. They also showed that the virus could be transmitted. So they basically inoculated a group of cats and a group of ferrets, and they housed them with some uninfected animals, and they showed that they were able to cause transmission. None of the cats became sick. They were able to culture live virus. They were able to detect it by PCR tests. And so really these cats were asymptomatic carriers. They had no evidence of disease. The ferrets did actually become quite unwell, and one of them died. 3 of the ferrets became quite sick and developed severe pneumonia, and they also were able to culture virus from them. So, but after that, really we heard nothing about SARS coronaviruses in pets, and not really any more research was done because the original SARS coronavirus epidemic went away in that same year. So now we scroll forward to 2020, and as you can see, this was it was this original information that informed the strategy here to start doing some animal testing. So what has happened here since February, animals, dogs and cats belonging to people who have confirmed COVID-19 infections have been quarantined voluntarily for a 2-week period, and animals were tested on admission to the quarantine facility, and then they went home after 14 days, or if they tested positive, after they had 2 negative consecutive test results. So when they first started testing cats and dogs on arrival, they collected swabs from the nasal cavity and from the mouth. They collected rectal swabs and feces, and they tested for the virus by using a reverse transcriptase PCR. The first cat and dog tested negative, and then the 3rd dog made headlines around the world. So you're probably familiar with the 17-year-old Pomeranian that did make headlines as the first animal in the world to be test positive for COVID-19. So that Pomeranian tested positive on nasal swabs and oral swabs, but it had no COVID-19 signs, and it had quite a low viral load. So there's a lot of debate in the media about whether this dog was actually infected or whether it was contaminated from its owner. Maybe the owner sneezed and its oronasal cavity was contaminated with the virus. And so they tested that dog again a couple of days later, and it was positive, and still the debate raged. But then the dog continued to test positive on multiple occasions, really ruling out any possibility that it was contaminated from the owner. To be test positive on a PCR for so many consecutive days was consistent with infection. But during that time, the dog showed no COVID-19 signs. And infection was confirmed in this dog. It did seroconvert and it tested antibody positive. The researchers who were doing the testing tried to culture the virus and they were unable to do so. So pretty unequivocal evidence that dogs could be infected by SARS coronavirus too. This dog went home, but it was 17, it had underlying cardiovascular and renal disease, and unfortunately it passed away just a few days after it went home, and no post-mortem was permitted. And I just wanted to run over or refresh your minds about how we can test for the virus and what the test results mean. So we can test by reverse transcriptase PCR, and that just detects viral RNA fragments that are reverse transcribe to cDNA, and then you do a PCR and read the sequence. And but that doesn't necessarily show that the virus is viable, but it will be positive during infection. If you culture virus, then the sample is contagious. We would expect only to have positive cultures during active infections. And of course, our serology is confirmatory. It confirms that the virus has been replicating in the animal. But a seropositive animal is not necessarily contagious. And the time that it takes to become contagious can vary. And we'll look a little bit at that as we go on. So I can now share with you data of all the animals that have been tested here in Hong Kong since quarantine started. I didn't include the 2 hamsters. I'm not quite sure how they got included in the quarantine, but I think the decision of the government was to quarantine all mammalian pets, and someone just happened to have 2 hamsters. But of the dogs and cats, there were 30 dogs tested altogether and 18 cats. And these animals mostly belong to people that were confirmed COVID positive. A few of them belong to close contacts. So in the case of the dogs, there were 2 dogs that tested positive. So in addition to the Pomeranian, not long after, a 2-year-old German Shepherd also tested positive. He tested positive on multiple swabs, and he also had a positive antibody test. And he's also the only dog in the world from which a positive culture sample has been obtained. So he remained healthy. He developed no signs of COVID-19, and he went home to his owners. And those 2 dogs, if you want to read more about how they did it, how they did the testing, you can just download the paper. It's been published in Nature. So it's not very often that veterinary case reports make it to Nature, but these ones certainly did. Interestingly, from the 2 dogs, they also used next generation sequencing to amplify the whole virus genome that was infecting both of those dogs, and they found that it was identical to the owner in each case. And that's as we would expect with a human to animal transmission. And then just not that long ago, maybe about a month ago, the first cat in Hong Kong tested positive. And that's not a picture of the cat, and she's in fact a 7-year-old female neutered exotic domestic shorthair, and she also tested positive on multiple PCR tests of nasal, oral and rectal swabs. Her antibody test was positive, but her culture test was negative. And she lived in a house with 3 people who all had confirmed COVID-19 and went to hospital. Fortunately, all of her owners were okay, and they were very glad to be able to pick up their cat at the end of their ordeal. So she was healthy, she remained healthy throughout, and her genome sequence was, the sequence of the virus that infected her was also identical to one of the owners. So we do have some evidence then, as a result of this data, that human to animal transmission of COVID-19 can occur, but it obviously didn't occur very commonly based on this particular sample set. And bearing in mind that these were all animals in a very high risk environment, belonging to mostly to people with confirmed COVID-19. In the case of the cat, of the 18 cats, 13 of them belonged to confirmed COVID-19 patients, and 5 of them belong to close contacts, and we don't have the COVID-19 status for those contacts. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what other evidence of infection we have, both experimentally and naturally, in natural cases of infection. So I guess this is the first big paper that came out. You probably saw this one on the news as well. It was published in the journal Science, and it was the first experimental study to look at susceptibility of not just ferrets, cats and dogs, but also some other species as well to the virus. So I'm just going to go through a few slides looking at what that study found, and since then there's been a couple of other studies. But I guess the key takeaway messages, first of all, were that dogs didn't seem to be very susceptible to the virus, and I guess we've seen a lot of that. And I think the newspaper heading sums it up pretty well. Coronavirus can infect cats, dogs not so much. So in this study, they inoculated 5 dogs with the virus intranasally, and they used a strain of the virus that came from the Wuhan seafood markets that had caused clinical infection in a person. And they also did tried to do transmission studies. So they infected the beagles and they housed them next to some uninfected beagles, and they took some swabs from them, and basically they found that none of the in-contact beagles became infected, and none of the inoculated beagles shed any virus, but 2 of them were antibody positive. So they found evidence of low-level infection in just 2 of the dogs. They weren't able to culture the viruses, and their conclusion was that dogs have low susceptibility to the virus. They also looked at disease in ferrets, and they did the same thing, but they didn't do a transmission study. So they inoculated the ferrets with some intranasal virus, and then, as you can see on the slide here, they took some did some nasal washes and rectal swabs, and they looked for the presence of the virus by PCR. They also did culture and serology as well. So a couple of the ferrets became unwell, but none of them died. So what about cats? They looked at cats as well, and this is where they showed for the first time that cats can transmit the virus to non-infected cats. So they basically had 3 pairs of cats, and 3 of the cats were 8 months old that were infected, and 3 were 2.5 to 3 months old, and they housed them with uninfected cats. But of each of those groups, only 1 pair of cats in each group showed transmission. And in the older cats, none of them became unwell, but one of the juvenile cats died. There really wasn't much information about the juvenile cat that died, so we don't really have a lot of information about what happened to it, other than that they did find some evidence of severe respiratory inflammation. But these cats were given very high doses of virus intranasally, and that doesn't necessarily mimic what's happening in natural infections. So there were a few question marks after that study, and since then 2 more studies have come out, and we've got more information about the disease in cats, and what we're finding is that experimental infections are mostly subclinical. So in these 2 other studies that have since come out, they have all been subclinical. So the first one that was published just a few weeks ago in the New England Journal of Medicine, again, was a transmission study, 3 pairs of cats that were inoculated intranasally, and in this study all 3 in-contact cats did become infected. All of the cats shed virus for between 4 and 6 days. All of them were antibody positive, and none of them had clinical signs. And then just this week, or just a few days ago, this new study has come out, and you can find it on bioRxiv, which is a preprint server site that's you can download this publicly. It's not reviewed yet, but it is a very good study. I've spoken with the investigators, and they've really done a great job in this study. And again, what they did was they showed that experimental infections in cats were subclinical. So they infected 7 cats in total. There were 2 cats that they did transmission studies in, and both of those cats became infected. None of the cats developed clinical signs. They took chest x-rays. This is the only study where really thorough clinical data has been collected. They also put thermal microchips in the cats before infection and monitored their temperatures. None of them developed fevers, became febrile. They all mounted antibody responses between 7 and 14 days after infection. And they also euthanized some of the cats and did histology on them, and they did find evidence of subclinical disease. So there was evidence of mild interstitial pneumonia as well as mild rhinitis and tracheitis. Interestingly, they also found that the cats that were infected by being in contact with the inoculated cats shed virus for longer. So they shed virus for 7 days, whereas the experimentally infected cats only shed virus for 5 days. But again, in total, what these studies show is that, yes, cats can be infected with the virus, but they have a pretty short period of viral shedding. And the other thing that this second study showed that nobody else has shown so far is that actually these cats were immune to re-challenge. So 28 days after they had been infected, they knew that they were seropositive. They attempted to infect them again intranasally, and then they collected swabs from them every few days for a couple of weeks afterwards, and none of the cats became infected. So that's encouraging. It shows that cats become immune after they are infected. There's been talk about models of infection and some hope for vaccines on the back of this research. If cats can become immune, hopefully we can too. But the big question is, well, how long is that immunity going to last for? And that's something that will take longer to find out. Okay, so moving on, I guess that begs the question, what is the extent of these infections in animals globally? And just before, I'm just going to go back to this other slide for a second. These guys from Colorado State University also looked at disease in dogs, and they infected 3 dogs. None of them developed clinical signs, none of them shed virus. But they did become infected because they all seroconverted. But basically the findings of this study really confirm the findings of the first study and show that dogs are less susceptible to infection than cats, and that cats experimentally infected have subclinical disease. Okay, so how common is infection globally? You guys have probably seen some of these reports coming out. We had a report from Wuhan, from the epicenter, the original epicenter of the outbreak, that showed that, and so basically people are starting to do serology, serosurveillance to look at the extent of infection, and obviously widespread serological surveillance is going to be the most sensitive way of determining the prevalence of infection of animals in the field. So this is the first serological study to come out, and most of these cats were, I think about 3 or 4 of them belonged to confirmed COVID-19 patients, and the rest of them were they were cats that were in a shelter, and possibly it's quite likely that they were being handled by COVID-infected people. But nevertheless, they found 11% of those cats were positive. Then after that, another study came out. You might have seen this one about the vet students, cats and dogs living with vet students, and they found none of these animals, 21 in total, were positive. So no evidence of infection on PCR or on serology. Okay, so now I'm going to look at what's been happening in the news in terms of natural cases of infection. So we've seen experimentally, and we've seen the natural asymptomatic infections in Hong Kong, but now there've been a few reports of animals having COVID-19-like illness. So this is probably the first case of COVID-19 illness in a cat. You probably read about this one as well. So that this cat belonged to a lady who had been in Italy, and when she came back to Belgium, she developed COVID-19, and her cat became ill about a week after she did. It had diarrhea, vomiting, and dyspnea, and it was PCR positive. It recovered, and culture wasn't performed. So that was sort of the first clinical case, and then after that we started to hear about the lions and tigers in the zoo. So this was interesting because there was actually not just one animal, but there were 6 tigers and lions altogether that developed COVID-19 signs, and they were coughing. So in this particular case, they anaesthetised one of the tigers and took swabs and confirmed that it was positive. And then the story got a little bit more interesting when they realised that actually they didn't have to anaesthetise all the other animals. They could actually potentially test their faeces. We know that the virus can be shed in faeces, although it seems to be shed in faeces at much lower viral loads than it is in respiratory and oral secretions. But nevertheless, they confirmed that this group of lions and tigers was actually COVID-19 infected. And I guess, you know, we really don't know what the difference in species susceptibility is, for example, between lions and tigers and domestic cats, but nevertheless, another animal species that can be infected. Then we had the 2 cats in New York that became the first US pets to test positive for COVID-19, and these both had signs of respiratory illness, but in one of these cats, it actually most likely had fulminant pulmonary edema from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and the SARS-CoV-2 viral infection was unlikely to be contributing to the reason for why this cat was actually euthanized. But nevertheless, we started to see some more positive cats, and again, there was the cat in France. I love this picture, that tested positive. There's also been a cat in Russia as well. And then, interestingly, there was this report of a student's dog in the US testing positive. This was part of a study by Duke University where they were looking at testing humans and their pets together and from the same household to get an idea about transmission. So this started to cause a little bit of publicity. It was positive on a nasal swab, but then just not so long after, it turned out that was actually false positive and the dog was not infected at all. So not much more on that story. So we're starting to get a little bit more of an increased understanding about the likelihood of human to animal transmission, but we haven't really talked much about ferrets. So let's talk about their close relations, the mink. And this is probably a much bigger and more important and more serious story than any of the domestic animal infections that we've spoken about so far. So as you can see, you've probably again heard about this on the news, that COVID-19 has broken out in a number of mink farms in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is one of the few places in the world where mink are still farmed in very high numbers. So as you can see there are about 800,000 farmed mink in the Netherlands, in about 155 farms. So they're large farms with large amounts of animals. Since 2013, no new farms are able to be established by law, and they are mandated to close in 2024. But that industry is quite lucrative. It's worth $100 million a year. China is a top importer, and it also farms a lot of mink as well. So The mink on these farms actually became sick. There were some unexpected deaths, pneumonia, GI, and other respiratory signs. And this story got a little bit more interesting because there has been some discussion about where is the transmission coming from. In all of the other animal cases that we've spoken about so far, it's been quite clear that transmission has been from human to their pet. And it's been quite clear that there's been no pet to human transmission. But the mink story has shaken things up a little bit, and we still don't know all of the answers to this story. But there has been letters written to the government in the Netherlands suggesting that this could be the first animal to human infection in 2 farms. It's still not really clear what evidence there is. I think we're going to have to wait for the published data to come out. It's from the information that's publicly available. It's suggested that the mink became sick before the humans did. They also sequenced the virus from the mink in these farms and from the farmers that were infected. And what they found is that they were the same as would be expected, but that doesn't tell us about the directionality of the transmission. Regardless of whether it's mink to human or human to mink, you're going to get the same viral genome. But what they did find was that the virus sequence from the mink and their farmers was very different to the viral sequence that is currently circulating around other parts of the Netherlands. So it doesn't really tell us how the mink initially got infected, but I'm guessing there must be some more to this story that's not yet in the public domain. And then to make things a little bit more interesting, they also found that some unowned farm cats also tested seropositive, in fact 7 of 24 cats. So, it starts to raise questions about multi-species transmission, and also, about in mink farms, they found very high quantities of virus in the dust, and also found the virus in the manure. So this becomes more of a public health issue when we are talking about such large numbers of animals being infected, with some suggestion or possibility of animal to human transmission. Watch this space. It may be that some of these animals are culled going forward. We really don't know, but there certainly are a lot of question marks. But back to the original question, what is the risk of animal to human transmission? Sure, there's a potential problem with farmed mink. But, in our business, where you're practicing, with cats and dogs, what is the risk of animal to human transmission? And, I pulled out the figures. This is just a few hours ago. So, sadly, we're now at nearly 6.5 million cases of COVID-19 around the world. But looking at the evidence, on the plus side, the number of cases transmitted by cats and dogs to humans is 0. So we can at least provide some reassurance to our owners and also to our staff that this is not a significant threat. However, I should also stress that the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, and because of that we need to act with an abundance of caution, just in case any transmission could occur. There is no evidence of transmission, but all the same, as we would for any potential zoonosis, PPE and biosecurity is paramount. Are we an at-risk occupation? No, we're not. Our greatest risk is from our pets' owners rather than from the pets themselves. We are an essential occupation, but we're certainly not an at-risk occupation. So let's talk a little bit then about the virus, how long it can survive, I won't talk much about PPE because you've all been doing it and you will have had protocols in your practice for a number of months now. But you know, there's data starting to come out and it tells us how long the virus can survive. And I guess the key things to note are that, you know, the virus can survive for a long time at cold temperatures, you know, over 14 days at 4 degrees. But it really can't survive at high temperatures, and it doesn't like humidity very much either. It can survive in aerosols, but not for very long because it's a very heavy virus. And it can, I thought this was an interesting one, it can survive on banknotes for up to 2 days and on plastic for up to 2 to 3 days. We had a scare here in Hong Kong recently. There was some concern that someone may have been infected from packing vegetables that were wrapped in plastic that had come from the UK. So, I mean, I guess it's just always a reminder that indirect transmission, whilst it's not common, can indeed occur. I guess on the plus side, the virus is highly susceptible to common disinfectants, including 70% ethanol household bleach at low concentrations, and all of the disinfectants that we use in veterinary practice, like F10 and chlorhexidine. So that's on the plus side. I guess we've all been through the concern about fomite transmission, and you know, whether if an infected owner has sneezed on their cat or their dog or on the carrier, whether you know, that could be a mechanism for transmission. And of course, fomite transmission can occur. No one's done any studies to look at how long virus can survive on the coat of pets, but it certainly doesn't seem to be a high risk of transmission at all. And the current recommendation is that bathing of animals is not required when they come into our practices. No doubt you have looked at a lot of different resources on the web, but I just wanted to draw your attention to some more that are available, in addition, of course, to our own AVA resource, which is your go-to resource for keeping up to date for what's happening in Australia. But looking globally as well, there are some other good websites. I think that AVMA has got some excellent information about minimising exposure and guidelines for PPE and all those sorts of things. It's a really good website. So if you haven't had a look at that one, it's definitely worth looking at. And also the International Society of Companion Animal Infectious Diseases has put together a task force. I'm on that task force, so is Michael Lappin and Scott Rees and Jane Sykes, and we're writing updates and articles every few weeks that will go up on that website. So we've got a couple of articles up there already. And you know, if you sort of want to get a good distillation of the facts, you can easily get them. And of course, I'll show some other websites as well. Of course, the WSAVA website is absolutely excellent as well. So, you know, let's get back to basics. We can be confident that, you know, in the advice that we give to our pet owners, we're getting more and more information about this disease. We need to tell them to protect themselves against being infected, and of course to avoid close contact with their pets if they suspect they have COVID-19. And I think, you know, what's new in, you know, what's going to sort of be different here on in terms of infection control and the advice we give owners about handling their pets is to consider washing their hands both before and after contact with their pet, because in this particular scenario we're more worried about giving the infection to the pet rather than the other way around. There's been a bit of controversy about cats and whether you should keep them indoors in the UK. That's been quite a controversial topic. I don't think it's particularly controversial in Australia because of curfews anyway. And I think social distancing of animals is a good idea, whilst there is a high caseload. And so now I just, in the last sort of 5 minutes, just want to talk a little bit about testing. because that's sort of what people are naturally starting to ask questions about as we sort of move through the initial phases of the pandemic, and we want to know more about exposure. Where are we at with animal testing? So I'll direct you to a couple of resources on that. The CDC side is not bad, and in the US, the policy is pretty clear. Routine testing is not recommended, but let's look at what the World Health Organization for Animals is saying. They've got a great website as well, if you haven't seen that. And this is really sort of the go-to organisation for reporting of any animal cases. So of course, COVID-19 now is an emerging disease in animals and humans. So it is required that all cases of positive infection are reported to the OIE. But having said that, there's no reason for routine testing. And they give some epidemiological reasons about, what kind of settings might we as veterinarians be thinking about testing. And you can see here that, tigers in a zoo with signs of COVID-19 are certainly going to be a population of animals that we want to test or want to know more about. Animals in a animal shelter that suddenly come down with respiratory disease, once we've ruled out other infections, is going to be something that we want to know more about. But on an individual animal basis, it's certainly not recommended. So in terms of Australian policy, I would refer you to the Agriculture Government website, Animal Health Committee's website, and you can see on their policy statement from not very long ago that diagnostic testing and surveillance is only recommended on the advice of human and animal health authorities. And if you are considering testing patients, you need to consult with your state or animal health authorities. So if you live in New South Wales, and that's the New South Wales DPI, I just spoke to my good friend Sarah Britton, Dr. Sarah Britton, who's the New South Wales Chief Vet, earlier today. I think she's also been giving a webinar today about testing. So she kindly has given me this slide to share with you guys, and you can also pull this information off their website. So really there's not really any justification for individual animal testing unless there's a very high degree of suspicion and concern of COVID-19 illness, but you will need to consult with the DPI about that. And really, we need to be concentrating on ruling out common infections. So I think in New South Wales at the moment, there's only been 2 animals tested for this infection, and it's really not recommended as a routine. So let me point out some of those other websites. The ProMed, you might not be familiar with that one. That gives a daily wrap-up of what's happening with COVID-19 in humans and animals. Some of you might be familiar with the Worms and Germs blog site of Scott Weiss. That's a fantastic chatty blog sort of thing that you can just read with a glass of wine and know exactly if there's been any animal news on during the day. If you want more detail, go to the OIE website. You can find everything there, and the WHO as well. But WASAVA, of course, has got a great website and has been updated. So I think we're just about out of time. It's nearly 3/4 of an hour, and I'd like to thank you for sharing your evening with me. I'm going to turn my video back on. I really hope that the sound was okay. And thanks again. I'll hand you back to Danny.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Barrs, for an excellent webinar. We have a few questions that have come through now, so we'll go through those. And so the first question is, do you think there's a possibility that other species will become infected other than those you've reported on tonight?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and it will be interesting to see. I mean, I guess we know that rats and mice are resistant because they've got different receptors, so that's kind of comforting. rats and mice are susceptible to a whole host of other beta coronaviruses, but it looks like they're not susceptible to SARS-CoV-2, so that's good. Livestock don't seem to be susceptible, well, I should clarify that horses are not susceptible. But yes, there certainly may be other species that could become infected, and there are some nice papers out looking at the homology of the ACE2 receptor. I didn't talk much about receptors because it's sort of, late in the day, and we don't want to get too heavily into that, but you can pull up a number of papers, just type in ACE2 receptors and animals, and you can get a whole list of what other animals might be susceptible. But having said that, I should say it's not just receptor homology that determines whether an animal is susceptible or not, because there's not much difference between dogs and cats in their actual ACE2 receptors, but there clearly is a difference in the ability of the virus to bind and enter cells and cause infection.
Great. And then another question is, what piece of advice do you have for hysterical pet owners that are considering euthanasia of their pets because of concerns over COVID-19?
Oh wow. Okay, thank you so much for that question. I'm really sorry that that's happening, and I'm kind of surprised that that's happening. We've been really proactive here in trying to do a lot of media to prevent people from being hysterical and abandoning their pets. There's been a hell of a lot of concern in Hong Kong, and I know that it happened in China to some extent. I do have some videos that I'd be really happy to share with you. Please email me, vanessa.barrs@cdu.edu.hk. I'd love to share with them. But look, I think that we can be really confident in reassuring them. I think there's two things that I do. One is to reassure them that they're not going to get infection from their pet, but the other thing is to remind them of their responsibility as pet owners. And there's not much more that we can do other than that. But I'm really sorry that that's happening, and hang on in there.
Thanks, Vanessa. I'm sorry for such a curveball question, and I imagine that's the minority of pet owners in Australia, but there certainly are, it would seem from the question panel, the odd pet owner who is asking that question. So those resources, I imagine, would be invaluable for veterinarians to refer clients to.
No worries.
Next question is, many practices are routinely bathing pets on admission to hospital or boarding, and this is not always for pets that have come from a COVID positive household. It's for all pets that are entering the hospital for a stay. Do you think that's necessary in the current environment?
No, I don't think it's necessary in the current environment, and the American Veterinary Medical Association gives that advice. When at the beginning of the outbreak, when case numbers were really high, it was something that people were doing. But look, it's certainly not necessary as a routine, and I don't think you need to do it.
Perfect. And then the other question is as well regarding social distancing within the clinic. So the question is that some practices are still maintaining that clients stay outside to try and reduce the exposure to the client and also to the hospital team. Do you have any guidance on whether you think that is still necessary and whether that's something that should be continued in practices throughout the next few months?
Yeah, look, thank you for the question. That's actually quite a hard question for me to answer, being here in Hong Kong, and the reason is because in Hong Kong everybody wears masks and social distancing is used a hell of a lot less. It's just not possible with 7 million people living in a really high urban density to social distance. But so I guess I think that we need to take precautions, and we need to think about what are the best ways to prevent viral infection. The social distancing and hand hygiene absolutely work, but there are other things that you can do that you may already be doing, which is temperature check on everybody that comes into your practice, and also getting them to sign a statement saying that they have not been in contact with anyone who's been diagnosed with COVID-19 in the last 2 weeks. That is a routine thing here for entry into any establishment. The other thing that you can do, and some practices do here, is provide surgical masks to your clients. I don't know what the PPP situation is for you guys at the moment. If you can access masks readily, I know there's controversy in Australia about face masks, but from someone living in Hong Kong and from the evidence that has come out in the scientific literature, they work. And the reason that they work is that infection in humans, speaking and breathing is a really big way of spreading infection. So it's not just sneezing, but speaking when our clients are giving histories. So me personally, that's something that I would do, would be if I had easy access to masks, I would ask the clients to pop them on when they came in for the consult. That's a lot easier than social distancing. So look, there are some suggestions. I don't know how viable they will be for you in practice.
Yeah, excellent suggestions, Vanessa, and I think that many of those suggestions can be easily implemented in practice to try and reduce everybody's risk and exposure. So thank you so much again for all of those questions, everyone. Unfortunately, we're out of time today. Thank you so much for attending the webinar, and we hope you enjoyed this session. And a very special thanks to Professor Barrs for putting today's presentation together and for giving up her time to share her knowledge with us. Thank you everyone for attending. If you'd like to learn more about the Pause and Learn webinar series, about PetSure or our gap-only program, please visit our website or follow us on social for more updates. Thank you so much again, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Danny. Are we done?